Scammell, and this is my final thesis presentation for GPE 4700 at the University of Manitoba, which is Global Political Economy, by the way. So I'd like to start off by giving a land acknowledgement. I'm speaking from Treaty 1 territory, and the electricity allowing me to give this presentation is being generated in Treaty 5 territory. To give a short overview of the research project itself, this is a picture of the Grand Rapids Generating Station, located about 400 kilometers north of Winnipeg, built by Manitoba Hydro, and I'll be applying the Critical Environmental Justice Studies framework to this as a case study. In terms of literature, there's a few studies that have documented the impacts from this dam's construction on different communities, and so that formed the kind of foundation of my data that I reviewed. There have been studies on Manitoba Hydro elsewhere in the province and its dams, and so that stuff formed kind of some of the context for my analysis. And there has been limited usage of the Critical Environmental Justice Studies framework. It's fairly new, coming kind of about in the last 10 years or so, and so I reviewed those and used those to inform my approach as well. But I did notice some gaps in the literature. They were mostly American-based. There wasn't a lot of look at renewable energies. There was a reliance on the point source polluting industries, and there wasn't any Indigenous-specific case studies. Usually they were involved with analyses that focused on Black or Latinx communities in the United States, or in Ingrid Waldron's case, historically Black communities in Nova Scotia, where she did also talk with First Nation communities in that province as well. And so I wanted to address those gaps by using this approach and this case study. The theory itself is kind of based on 4 different pillars that look to address limitations within kind of a more traditional environmental justice framework. So they incorporate 4 fundamental pillars. First one being multiple social categories of difference, wanting to become deeply intersectional, not just looking at race and class anymore, but also gender identity, sexual orientation, species, etc. They really want to look at how these interact to create environmental injustice. And the second one is multiscalar analysis. They take a much broader look at spatial and temporal kind of scales, including historical conditions, striving for a more holistic understanding and also taking into account cumulative impacts as well. Thirdly, they take an anti-statist stance. There's been a large focus on policy mechanisms for remedying environmental harm. This has not and probably will not create any significant progress in addressing something like environmental racism. So it's like asking the same institution to correct the problem it created. It's not going to be productive. And so fourth, they center social justice within the approach via the concept of indispensability. It's adding an ethical imperative as a central feature of the theory, rejecting the view of some communities as expendable or kind of being able to be sacrificed for the greater good. This is mentioned in environmental justice frameworks, but it's made much more explicit with the critical added onto it. And so to talk a little bit about the methods, I was using a mixed approach, some qualitative data and quantitative data, but I'm not going to talk too much about that. And on to the results. So there was 5 communities that have been impacted. They're primarily Cree and Métis. There was 2 that I couldn't find sufficient data on, Opaskwayak Cree Nation and Cormorant. So I focused mainly on these 3. They're mostly Cree, as you can see there. And then the second kind of names there, or the municipalities, technically, like, they're not reserves, but they're formed mainly of Métis people, and some white families as well. And so, kind of with regards to the first pillar, it was pretty obvious that, social category of differences, like Indigenous, they're facing specific impacts from that. there was a lot of physical violence kind of perpetrated on them in Grand Rapids when the dam was being built from the southern workers. Women especially were facing high rates of sexual violence, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Non-human impacts were huge population declines in fish, mammals, aquatic life, birds, you name it. Trees were falling in water all the time from erosion. It's not a good sight. Hydro workers themselves, white ones, were receiving much more benefits. Like during construction, First Nations workers were facing discrimination, unfair labor practices, while working for Manitoba Hydro as subcontractors. And still to this day, they receive subsidized accommodations, such as dual hydrometers on their company-owned homes, whereas the local residents do not. And white workers often have better paying jobs, such as engineering, stuff like that, whereas the First Nations workers are more likely to be working on stuff like maintenance. Second, there's multiscalar analysis of impacts. There's physical effects on the body, such as methylmercury contamination, diet changes. There's also spiritual, kind of social effects on the community, such as loss of happiness, increased depression. There was a lot of interference with burial grounds, and so that was really affecting people. There was a loss of livelihoods, destruction of the traditional way of life. Fishing and trapping, hunting opportunities were all diminished, and the economic potential in general for the area that was flooded was really destroyed. Ranching had just started, and the Manitoba government really didn't recognize earnings from the bush, using air quotes right now, because they just kind of assumed that people weren't making any money if they didn't have any income, and kind of disregarded the subsistence type of lifestyle. And other kinds of scales were provincial and national. Provincially, the benefits are flowing from northern Manitoba down to southern Manitoba. It's pretty obvious. National dimension, the federal government kind of abdicated its responsibility. It was not responsible for the destruction that occurred, but it was also not really kind of taking the side of the First Nations either. And there's also the international component as well, in which Manitoba Hydro sells electricity to the United States at lower rates than it charges for Manitobans, and so that's a differential treatment as well. And on to the third pillar, there's in terms of the anti-statist approach, Manitoba Hydro's not going to reform itself. I saw quite a few instances of civil disobedience being used in terms of the communities trying to force the government or Manitoba Hydro to address their problems, because the prescribed procedures were just not working for the communities to try to get their ear. And so blockades were used quite a bit, protests, stuff like that. And the Manitoba government, it's not going to reform Hydro itself, because it didn't really matter if it was NDP or Conservative. They were both building destructive dams. They were both, paying measly settlements. It's almost the same thing. Didn't matter which political party. And if you think about it in terms of the government serving the people or whatever, the Indigenous population in Manitoba only constitutes 17% of the population. So the vast majority are going to be benefiting and, not facing those impacts that is being felt in the north. And so even if it's majority rules, then that's exactly what's going to happen. We're going to have a racist outcome. In terms of the concept of indispensability, racism in Manitoba, I shouldn't need to tell this. This shouldn't be new news to anybody that's from here. Racism in Manitoba and Winnipeg is widespread and systemic. Winnipeg is often called the most racist city in Canada, where Manitoba Hydro has its headquarters. Hydro bills are higher in northern Manitoba due to electric heating, and similar impacts of intentional flooding have not been experienced by white communities. Politically, it's just not possible, and so we really need to get rid of that expendability kind of logic for these types of communities. And so, in conclusion, spread the word. There's a lot more North Manitoba Hydro then meets the eye. It's, like using these four pillars, the project is emblematic of issues regarding environmental injustice. The concentration of environmental harm from this project within Cree and Métis communities, like it proves that Indigenous communities were being affected much more. Like no similar harm was being found exacted upon any white communities. So in terms of widespread racism within Manitoba and Winnipeg already, this is obviously filtering into Manitoba Hydro's actions and dealings with these Indigenous nations. When Manitobans or Winnipeggers turn their lights on, they don't think about northern communities. They don't think about that total community destruction. Manitoba Hydro has had a very effective PR campaign, skewing public opinion to view them as sustainable and equitable. In terms of sustainability, they really push their green and renewable energy narrative. This is obscuring the fact that environmental damage from flooding is extensive. Animal populations have been decimated. This is fish, birds, mammals, you name it. Erosion's extensive. Trees are constantly falling in the water. Methyl mercury contamination increased in Cedar Lake after it was flooded, closing the fishery for a number of years. Manitoba Hydro really emphasizes that the two most recent dams, Wasquatam and Kiosk, are examples of a new chapter in their history of dam construction. And this is kind of just obscuring that history of oppression and bad deals. Their settlement agreements do not amount to adequate compensation. That compensation is a tiny fraction of what I found their revenue to be. It's horrible. Only about $30 million has been given in total to the communities, whereas they make about $100 million a year from that dam. So it's these new deals aren't all that great anyways, and it really kind of takes away from the fact that they haven't repaired that harm that they caused in the past. In my opinion, the Manitoba government is essentially engaged in criminal behavior. They have not adequately consulted with communities, the past or present. They haven't conducted proper, rigorous environmental impact statements, and they engage in greenwashing, which is by itself illegal. And in terms of the kind of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls report, this was the Calls for Justice number 13.4 in their final report. And I'll just read it. At a minimum, we support the call of Indigenous women and leaders for a public inquiry into sexual violence and racism at hydroelectric projects in Northern Manitoba. It's very clear that, this mural that Manitoba Hydro has painted in, right near Polo Park in Winnipeg it's bogus. Building dams that impact a small First Nation and Métis population for the benefit of a much larger white population is racist. It's an environmental racism. The solutions are not going to be easy to find, but they'll likely need to be found outside the government for the time being, via protests, petitions, etc. It's, something that we really need to get more creative about. The wholesale destruction of the regional environment around Grand Rapids, along with the impacts to the Cree and Métis people of this region, definitely make this dam a case of environmental racism. And that's all. Thank you very much. Goodbye.